Hey everybody, Brett Rice with Core Vision Financial Group, coming to you today with another video in our series on financial topics. Today we're going to be talking about long-term care planning with Grant Reeves. If you could go to our YouTube page and subscribe, you'll be notified when we post new videos. Thank you again for taking the time to watch our videos. Well, Grant, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so real quick, give everybody a quick bio of who Grant Reeves is and what Grant Reeves does.
So my background, coming at this from a bit of a hybrid approach, I'm actually was an attorney before I came into financial advising, and I'm still a practicing attorney. So we're talking about long-term care today, and there's elements that are both financial and legal on that, so we can kind of touch on both of those today.
Yeah, so that's great. So a lot of people, a lot of times will ask, what is long-term care planning? When should it begin? How much do I need? That type of stuff. So I'm hoping, we get to cover a lot of those topics today. But let's start with the beginning. Like, how do you get started in long-term care planning?
I think on long-term care planning, it means different things at different phases of life. Some of those are going to start earlier. Probably the first phase is just to be aware that you may need long-term care. Some people aren't even sure what long-term care means when I raise that with them. And basically what we're talking about most likely is a nursing home or perhaps assisted care at home, where you're going to have a long-term commitment. Medicare, other than in certain very limited circumstances, following usually a hospital stay, doesn't kick in and cover much, and that's for a very short period of time. So after that period of time is open, or is over, or if that period of time doesn't apply, you're going to have to fund that some other way. There's a few ways overall to fund that. One would be to self-fund that, where if you have enough assets and enough income, you manage that yourself. You can buy one of a few types of insurance products to additionally help with that, and then or perhaps you have things available to use. Some military benefits will have long-term care built into them sometimes. And then on the back end is where you get into more of the legal planning, where it's asset protection, and the goal of asset protection is to spend enough assets down or to protect enough assets that you qualify for Medicaid to kick in and cover your long-term care, where basically you're under the asset caps and you've spent enough down where Medicaid will kick in and cover that.
So, like you just said, I think it depends upon where you're at in your life, really, right? And whether you want to be able to cover it through self-pay, or you want to buy or add some financial product to your portfolio to help cover some of that. Mm-hmm. So when we start talking about long-term care, and you're talking about nursing home type care, in long-term care, what is covered and what's not covered in some of that stuff?
So there's a couple things that come into play. One is going to be more on the traditional long-term care, where you're in a nursing home. That's what most people think about. But it also can cover alternate, particularly home care at times. There's what's called the Medicaid waiver program that kicks in, and basically if that comes into play, you're going to need to establish a plan and show Medicaid that it's going to be more cost effective to provide that care at home. You may also have a long-term care product insurance product that's going to provide that care at home, versus having to go into that inpatient setting or in-house setting at a nursing home.
So when you're talking about Medicare coverage, Medicare doesn't cover everything, though, right?
Right. Medicare is really an health insurance product, and it will kick in. The only time it really covers anything on long-term care is going to be if you've been usually in a hospital stay setting for a limited period of time for rehab. After that hospital stay setting, you may have a certain period of time that Medicare will cover you to rehab at a long-term care facility. But that's a very short period of time. Once they have determined that you're either ready to go home, or even that you have just plateaued and you're not going to rehabilitate anymore, that Medicaid part will fall off, and then you will have to determine some other method for payment.
And, a lot of times when we're talking to people about doing, they'll ask, well, how much are we talking? Like, how much does private nursing home care costs? You know, when people are asking those type of questions, you know, trying to give those answers. Granted, there's a range, but
Right.
in general, what are we talking about?
What I've seen and what I've had clients facing here in relatively rural parts of Indiana are someplace in the $7,000 to $10,000 a month range for traditional long-term care, and then you're going to have varied degrees lower than that for different things that you can cover as far as home care, assisted living. If you're looking at those are going to be proportionally less. But if you end up with that full nursing home care, right now you're probably looking in that $7,000 to $10,000 range per month.
Yeah, so we're talking $80,000 to $120,000 a year.
Yeah.
So it gets very expensive. So trying to incorporate that into your financial plan and preparing for that possibility, you know, is something that could, you know, if you were to get into it without a plan, it could wreck your financial plan.
Right.
Yeah. So I think, you know, nobody knows in advance whether they're going to need these services or not, but you know, a lot of this stuff, it's just like when you buy other financial tools in your portfolio, life insurance and, you know, saving for retirement. Some people save for retirement and never make it there. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, it's just like the other tools. Hey, it's a possibility. We need to evaluate it. What's your family history? You know, what are those other things that go into that says how much of a reality do we think that is? And if it's a real reality, it's got to become part of your financial plan, and you have to make some decisions on how you want to approach that.
Right. And I get that quite a bit of people are like, I'm never going into long-term care. I'm just not going to do it. And I understand that, and certainly I hope those clients don't have to do that, but it's something you need to be aware of because it is a game changer with those dollar amounts, and sometimes we're not always in control of that, and you may end up in a situation you didn't anticipate where you do end up needing it.
So you talked about a second ago, you know, the ways to fund long-term care, right? We talked about self-funding, which, you know, if we're talking $80,000 to $100,000 a year, that's very expensive.
Right.
So that's something you need to start as soon as possible on, you know, accumulating assets for that.
Right. And I think when you're thinking about that, that's something where you would start probably younger in life, thinking about what you want your retirement to look like, and working with your financial professional to sort that out. That's going to be more at that point on the financial side than on the legal side as far as building up that retirement. One thing I run into on self-funding, and one thing to keep in mind, I will have clients that they're bringing in Social Security, they have their retirement income, maybe particularly around in Indiana, we'll have farm rental income, we'll have things like that it may actually add up to enough income to cover one spouse if they need the long-term care for one spouse at a time. But it can get challenging, and where you may need a backup plan in place as well to think about is what would happen if you would both need it at the same time, because that's going to be even a bigger draw on it.
Yeah. So. I mean, you're talking $160,000 to $240,000 a year.
Right.
And, you know, I would think that would wipe out most people's retirement plans within 4 or 5 years if the stay was that long.
Right.
And then you would be like, okay, you know, what happens now? Now all of our assets are gone. The plan's a mess. So, yeah, that's something to think about. You know, and then we start talking about long-term care insurance and financial products that are available to help cover those expenses.
Right. And those typically come into play sometime in where you want to start thinking about those, or middle-aged to upper middle age. One thing you don't want to do on long-term care insurance is wait until you're 75 or 80 and try and go and get a policy, because at that point you're too high of a risk. You're probably not going to be able to get particularly a traditional long-term care policy in any case. So that's one thing that I will tell clients if they're in that middle age range, that they may want to start thinking about if they want to quote long-term care. That probably that is that middle age to upper middle age is the range where they want to at least find out what that's going to cost and make a decision at that point. Is this the avenue I want to go? Is this the commitment I want to make, because it is going to be a financial commitment to do that? Or do I want to think about other options at that point? But that way at least you know, and you have that option available at that point. Whereas if you waited until you're 75 or 80, that's probably not going to be available.
So what's kind of like an appropriate age to be like, okay, I need to really get serious about a long term. Like, I know, like, if you think about it, say in your 30s, and you're like, hey, we're going to start setting aside some funds for that. At what point should you start making that decision of, hey, I need to kind of make a decision between traditional long term care, some hybrid plan, and, just doing those type of things?
The advice I see on that varies, and it may also depend on your health circumstances and things, because those will come into play as far as qualifying for some of these products. Typically, I would see sometime late 40s into 50s. I mean, certainly if you wanted to go ahead and get a quote during early 40s, it wouldn't hurt, just so you could at least understand what type of expense is going to be there. And then as you get older, probably the older you get, the more expensive it's going to get.
Yeah, because as you would imagine, because the cost is so high, these products are not inexpensive.
Right.
They're going to be very expensive as well.
Right, and that's one reason traditional long-term care in some cases has just become prohibitive. The premiums have gone up over time, and that's where some hybrid products have come into play that have elements of both life insurance and long-term care. They may not cover all of long-term care, but they may be something that would supplement. So say you're in that circumstance where you could cover part of one spouse being in a long-term care facility, you might look at a hybrid product that could help you supplement that gap or that shortfall that you have, or maybe would help kick in if you would end up in the circumstance where both spouses would need long-term care at the same time.
So some of these long-term care, like we talked about, they're very expensive. And from a financial standpoint, you don't want to say, well, just purchase one in your 40s. Well, I mean, are you going to carry that for 30 years? So I think some portion of it is a timing thing that You're like, well, because they're expensive, I don't necessarily want to buy them too early. You obviously don't want to wait too late. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, what's that right spot to where you're going to have it long enough and it's going to have accumulated, it's going to have done all the things it needs to do. So when you go to use long-term care, it's there and it's ready to go. That, because we get that question all the time is, when's the right time to buy it? Mm-hmm. And like you said, the older you get, the more expensive it gets, because it's not had the time to accumulate the things that it's supposed to do.
Right.
So I think that's a super tricky question, and it's, as most financial products go, it's very specific to each individual person's needs, right?
Right.
Whether it's the amount of money they can spend on it, the type of product that they're going to want to utilize, all of those things have different factors in that. So it might not be, hey, everybody fits in this 45 to 55 range. Some people may be able to get it earlier because they have the means to be able to do it, and other people may be like, well, I never thought it was going to be a need until they get into, say, their 50s, and now they're like, oh yeah, I really need to get on that. Also, historically, there were a bunch of these long-term care policies written in the past that people didn't understand when these things were developed, that how expensive long-term care was going to be. And some of these policies, I don't know if defaulted is the right word, but they became a burden on the insurance companies, and that's, in my mind, from what I've read, that's kind of part of the reason why it costs so much now is inflation, the cost of home care or nursing care going up, all of these things that the anticipated cost in the future is, I think in 20 years it's supposed to double. So, that's just mind-blowing when you start thinking about trying to save for that and cover that cost. That's a huge number.
Yeah, it is, and that's another reason you brought up one topic there. They had a lot of these did end up mispriced on old policies. Some companies got into trouble. The premiums have typically gone up as the companies have realized that they had underpriced some of these. Some of the clients that I've had that have good policies in place are actually older policies that they got lucky and they hit a company that was financially sound and is still able to ride that out. And that brings up a couple other points, is making sure that you're talking with your advisor to make sure it fits your particular situation. And then you're also looking at the financial health of the company with this long-term care insurance, because this is a a long-term commitment from them. Make sure that they're in this for the long haul and they're still going to be around when you need them to be around.
Yeah, the last thing you want to have to deal with is you did the work, and then the product you bought or the company you put your faith in ends up not being able to cover that or whatever.
Right.
So I want to say that one of the concerns of most people when they're getting into this is, right, they're wanting asset protection.
Right.
So let's talk about that a little bit. How can somebody go about, making sure that the stuff they're looking at covers those?
So typically what we're talking about asset protection, and people may not understand it because they think the government's literally going to come in and take their asset, which is usually not how this mechanically worked. What's going to happen is you're going to have to spend down assets until you get to a low enough point where you qualify for Medicaid. So that's really what we're talking about, is getting to that point where you would qualify for Medicaid. And then Medicaid would kick in and would cover your long-term care. So the catch on that is on a lot of these we have what's called a 5-year look-back period for Medicaid spend down, where Medicaid's going to go back for the previous 5 years and look to see if you've made any asset transfers. You're trying to dump things off to the kids, and then you come in and go, oh, Medicaid, I don't have anything. Come pay for me. They frown on that. And they will look back during that 5-year period to see if you have done anything during that period that seems to say that you could have paid for this, but you're just trying to pass this off. However, the way it is structured, there are certain things that we can do before that 5-year look-back period under current law, as far as being able to make certain transfers of assets in certain ways that will give that asset protection. And then as long as we get through that 5-year period, then those assets wouldn't count against you during that spend down process. Typically on those, I like people to at least discuss that's where the legal side comes in, or where I'm discussing that more as an attorney. I like people to at least start thinking about that and discussing that sort of when they're going into retirement age, maybe in that 65 to 70, maybe a little bit up into 75, depending on their health, where they understand what their retirement's going to look like. They understand these are the types of things I want to do. I may want to stay in this house, or I think I'm going to want to downsize. They've gotten into retirement, but they probably are still in pretty good health, and they're not worried. Legitimately, there's a relatively low risk that they would need to go into long-term care in the next 5 years. That's typically the time frame when I start to talk to people a little bit more about asset protection, because a lot of these means of asset protection do have some strings on them. So if you're in a fluid situation where you're actively managing business, buying, selling properties, they're going to be a bit of a pain to deal with at times, and that's typically why I like to try and balance that personally. Again, your legal advisor may say something differently, but in my practice, usually that's the point where I have people start talking about what can we start to do to protect individual assets here to get you to qualify for that Medicaid spend down.
And that's another thing that's tricky on the timing of those things, right? Is you may not have intended, a financial decision to impact that, and then say 3 years later you need to go into a nursing home, and they're like, well, what was this financial transaction about? And you're like, oh, that was something we had no idea. So it's something that can be very tricky on the timing as well, and that it's part of a plan that you say, hey, we did this based upon these reasons. Here, we're trying to do something different, and then have a different plan that says this is my long-term care plan. And somebody, you would have assets accumulating that you'd say, okay, well, I may have to use some of my own assets to get through that 5-year window, right? Some people, I think, I had a conversation with someone who one time, there had been an asset transfer within that 5-year window. And then when somebody went into the nursing home, right, it was like, well, we're not going to cover till that asset has been spent down.
Right.
And they felt like it was the government wronging them, right?
Right.
And it gets super tricky, and it gets very emotional, and people get really upset. So making sure that you have a plan and everybody's on board. Hey, look, we understand this is what the 5-year window is here, and this may be looked back upon, and you may have to offset that asset at some point and say, hey, yeah, this was moved. It wasn't intended to do that, but now we have to do this.
Right. Yeah, because what they will typically do is impose what's called a penalty period, and basically they'll take what your cost of care would be and the size of whatever that improper gift or transfer was, and divide that the amount of that gift or transfer by the cost of care, and that's going to be how long your penalty is, and you're going to have to come up with some means of funding through that penalty period to make up for that. Some families will incorporate that as a strategy if they've got somebody that can kind of step in and help pay. That can come into play as well if you work that out with your legal advisor and get that sorted out. But to me, it's a good idea to at least have that game plan in place a bit ahead of time, where you've at least had that discussion. That's when my clients come in for estate planning. I usually talk long-term care planning anyway, because I've seen people that come in when they're 80 and they're like, well, my lawyer never told me this. And I'm like, I don't want you to think I'm upselling you, but I want you to know that there is a 5-year look-back period. And if you want to do something, the time to do it, there are things we can still do when particularly if it's just one spouse going into the nursing home that they're more complicated and more challenging, and they may be more limited than what we can do if we've done that 5 years ahead of time, where there are some relatively simple steps we can take.
So when we talk about asset protection, are there, certain tools or skills or something you could use to work through that?
Yeah, typically there are a couple of main tools I use. One of them is really pretty simple, called a life estate deed. So basically what a life estate deed is you deed your property over to an heir or heirs. Frequently that's going to be your children. Often we'll see that being children in equal shares, so that say you have 3 children, they're going to inherit the property in equal shares as an undivided interest. And then you reserve a life estate unto yourself. And basically what that life estate says is that you can live there. You can, if it's farm ground, for instance, you would be able to continue to rent the property out. Usually that'll be structured in a way so that if you're getting better property tax benefits, being an older Hoosier, in my case, you'll continue to get that property tax benefit. But then when you pass away, you'll just go into the courthouse, file an affidavit, and it will automatically transfer to the kids. That automatic transfer is nice because it avoids probate, but the bigger benefit is that life estate deed, if you get to the 5-year look-back period, actually does give the asset protection. It's particularly strange because it gives the asset protection for Medicaid. They're content that this was a completed gift in 5 years, as long as the 5 years have passed. The IRS, however, does not view it as a completed gift, which is actually a good thing, because then you continue to get the basis step up in the property when you pass away. Whereas if it was a gift, an outright gift during life, you may have lost that tax benefit, because an outright gift in life, they may not get that basis step up. So, and it also usually will protect, say you had a child still getting financial trouble. If you had just given them the property outright, you may have a big problem, because that may be the child's asset outright. Right. Whereas usually on a life estate deed, if the child gets in trouble, they're not going to be able to come kick you out of your house at that point. They may come after the child later, but at least you're going to have comfort during your lifetime that there's not going to be an issue. That's a vehicle I use quite a bit for residences, and like I say, for farm ground. That really only comes up on the real estate side of things. If you have more financial assets you're trying to protect, or if you just have a more complicated scenario, the other vehicle that you typically will hear is an irrevocable trust. There's 2 types of trusts. There's revocable and irrevocable. The irrevocable, this is oversimplification, but basically means you can't revoke it. It's done. You're not going to change it. Once you set it up, you'll transfer the assets in, and it's pretty well locked down. There's some nuances to that and some other things we can do to finesse that a bit, and there's some more complications in trust law that we can protect that. But there are going to be more strings on it. That irrevocable trust is going to be its own entity for tax purposes, so you're going to have to manage taxes out of that. But if you make those asset transfers before the 5-year period, again, you're going to get that asset protection, where that's not going, whatever is in that umbrella of the trust. If it's bank accounts, if it's property, anything that's been titled over to that trust, if you make the 5-year period, those are also not going to be counted against you as far as an asset for Medicaid, the Medicaid countable assets, as far as the limit that you can have. Those are quite a bit more complicated. I do have people that have had those set up that they come in and end up talking to me, and it's clear they didn't quite understand what they did. They probably did do the right thing, but those in particular are pretty nuanced, and they have to be worded very carefully, because you have to have them set up so that Medicaid does see them as a complete and irrevocable gift that has been done, and that transfer has been done by the more than 5 years before. There are some other vehicles that will come into play and some other options if you talk to your attorney, but those are the two biggest that I typically deal with.
Okay. What about as we get into the later stages of life and then we're going through the spin down?
Right. The spin down, I probably won't go into too much detail here, but basically on the back end of this, so you made your plan, and if your plan is to go on to Medicaid, so you've transferred assets into a trust vehicle, an irrevocable trust vehicle or a life estate, you've done all of that. Right before you are ready to qualify, there's what's called a spin down period, and that's getting yourself down to a low enough level of what are called countable assets that you can then qualify for Medicaid. There's a list of those that you can step through. There will be certain funeral and burial expenses, certain, if you need to update your glasses, if you need something to help with your care, certain things like that you can step through as far as allowable spin down. That's going to be the last step, and really at that point you're going to want to sit down with whoever is advising you and go through that list. There's allowable lists. You can find them from the various governmental agencies as far as the whatever qualifies as a valid spin down. Some of them will get a bit strange. There'll be things that you may not anticipate. Sometimes you can cover certain burial expenses for family members, which I've always thought was a bit odd, but it's on the list, and that's where you really need to go through and figure out what is covered on that list and step through. That's really the last step on the back end, and that's going to be right when you're getting ready to qualify for long-term care.
So, as we talked about, it's kind of accumulation, asset protection, spin down, or kind of three. Are there any other pieces in there?
No, that's going to be the biggest part of it, and kind of thinking through that as a life cycle, that there may be different steps you take at different ages. It may be a combination of factors. You may protect some assets but get long-term care, and then hope you have enough long-term care in place to cover the likely period of time you might need long-term care. And so it may be a combination of these factors. It may be like I say, in my practice, one of the big ones is family farm ground. That one's relatively straightforward to protect, often with the life estate for my clients, and so that's something we can do that's kind of low-hanging fruit and pretty simple if they know that's going to want to pass on down. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach, but it's more of a process and thinking through things over time. Even if you think it might be too late, if you do have one foot in the nursing home or your spouse does, you can still reach out to legal counsel, and there are things that we can still do at that point. They are going to be a little bit more limited. They're probably going to be more complicated as well, because you've got Medicaid looking over exactly what you're doing by that point, and you've got to be really careful to make sure you've got your I's dotted and T's crossed. Frequently, it's going to be easier to protect assets for the community spouse at that point, the spouse that's not need the nursing home care. It may be a little bit harder to protect the family inheritance. It's going to be easier to protect that spouse because they don't want to impoverish the spouse. They want the spouse to be able to go ahead and continue living, but they may not be quite as forgiving about you trying to protect things to pass on down to your kids at that point as well.
Yeah, so we talk about, well, when's the right time? Also, it's never really too late.
Right.
It's going to be more expensive, and it's going to be a little harder to do asset protection and things, but still needs to be done.
Yeah, don't just throw your hands up and say, "Oh, I'm done." I mean,
missed the window.
Still go talk to somebody and
Absolutely.
see if there are options.
Yeah, your advisory team, right? Your financial advisor, your CPA, your attorney. Those people need to be consulted and be like, hey, look, I didn't plan on this before. What can I do now? What is still available to me to get these things done?
Right.
Yeah, that's a good idea because, a lot of times we talk about doing stuff early and the right time to do it and when to start, and it kind of makes people feel like, oh, I'm too late.
Right.
But that's not necessarily always the case. It's still best to just consult some professionals and say, what is available to me, right? Most decisions in life, the most important thing people don't do is understand all of their decisions or all of their options before they make that decision. Because then after the fact, you always hear people be like, oh, I didn't even know that was an option. Well, that's why you go consult a professional and say, what are all of my options?
Right, and I did have, it was not actually in a long-term care circumstance, but I did have somebody that they'd liquidated an account in the circumstance they were facing to try and bail themselves out, and they came to me like not too long after they liquidated it, and I could have protected that account if they would have come and talked to me.
Yeah.
And they wouldn't have had to clean it out. And that's, I hate to see that happen, and that's the same thing here where, yeah, you may be getting late, but you may still have options available if you at least reach out and discuss it with somebody and see it, particularly if in that case, on the late ones where you're trying to protect your spouse that's still going to be out in the community, there may still be options so that they make their life and their lifestyle better for those years when you're in long-term care.
Sure. So kind of in closing, kind of bringing this all together, how do you want to end this?
I guess on ending is just to say that long-term care is really an iterative process. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It's just something to think about and start stepping through. If you kind of approach it over time, it doesn't have to be too daunting, and just to be aware of those sort of milestones at various points in life and to talk with your legal and financial advisors about that.
Yeah, I think one thing we need to take away from this today is it's very important. B, we need to start as early as we possibly can, but also C, it's not too late.
Right.
Still at the end, it's still important. We still have options. Let's make sure we're investigating all of those before we just throw our hands up, like you said, and say it's too late.
Right.
All right, well, Grant, thanks for spending some time with us this morning and walking us through some long-term care planning. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And again, everybody, Core Vision Financial Group, Brett Rice, Grant Reeves, thank you for taking the time. Our contact information will be at the end. Please visit our YouTube channel and subscribe. Thank you very much.